On the 15th of February 1988, British television screens were treated to the rare, but oddly pleasing, sight of an astronaut carefully applying a fresh coat of paint to the exterior of a massive space cruiser. It's an incredibly striking contrast between the banality of our humdrum existence with the epic majesty found within many of the best science fiction concepts. This is how Red Dwarf announced its presence, joined by an imperious and majestic dirge to the future epic destiny of our species as we inevitably took our place amongst the stars. However, the series immediately contradicts this epic destiny with a reminder that, no matter where you go, humans will always be humans. Crass, tetchy, easily distracted and prone to bouts of random aggression. This strange show would eventually reveal itself to be a character piece, a largely two-hander with a few additional parts to add flavour and context to the central rivalry. Red Dwarf is at its heart about characters learning and failing to cope with each other and themselves, using science fiction as a vehicle to explore new scenarios that bring out the most unpleasant aspects of ourselves. It's the same spark that would inspire many future shows such as Rick and Morty, but done with over 2 decades less sophistication in television showrunning or even a tenth of the budget. None of the main cast were expected choices at the time. Red Dwarf was the first acting role of Craig Charles, who was a contemporary urban performance poet who moved around circles around the Liverpool music scene with ambitions towards being a stand-up comedian. He did take guest spots on panel shows and the like, and was originally brought in by the producers as they wanted his opinion on whether the scripts had a racist undertone. And to their surprise, Craig not only offered his approval for the script, but asked if he could audition for the lead. Barrie was a regular comedian most notable for his vocal impersonations, one of the voice artists behind Spitting Image, and a contemporary of Fry and Laurie, Rick Mayall and Ben Elton on Saturday Live. Despite lots of experience as a performer, this was his first formal role as an actor in an ongoing show. And Danny John-Jules, the third main character, was a dancer who starred in the original Starlight Express musical production, who had been taking bit parts in television shows for over a decade. Norman Lovett, the voice of the ship's computer Holly, was a stand-up comedian who had auditioned initially for the main part, but took this role that made the most of his deadpan humour. These men were presented with a script that had, to put it mildly, a bit of a troubled past. The original concept for Red Dwarf had originated from a radio sketch show called Dave Holland's Space Cadet, which riffed on realistic science fiction film concepts. Doug Naylor and Rob Grant wrote a script for the pilot episode, and they had it passed around from studio to studio, suffering repeated rejections for over 3 years before being accepted by BBC North. However, even after the cast had been assembled, an electrician strike meant that they missed the chance to film the pilot episode, and then, as the strike progressed, they missed a second opportunity until eventually it became clear the show was just probably not going to happen. Only continued pressure from the producers convinced the BBC to give this strange production, starring a script that nobody really wanted and lacking a single notable actor on its books, a second chance. And even after they got the go-ahead, Red Dwarf had a troubled production. Commissioned by BBC Manchester, the show was filmed near London, and these separate lines of authority and accountability meant that the show was given a bit of a cold shoulder by the local staff, and the producers blamed the local studio's refusal to cooperate with them as a problem throughout the show's first few years. Having assembled a cast of misfit actors, they were continuously dismissed by BBC upper management, and even years later, once the show had become recognisable enough to win an International Emmy Award, the stars were not invited to the celebration party put on by BBC bigwigs. Apparently, Craig Charles and Danny John-Jules were deemed a fire risk. The opening episode spends the majority of its runtime introducing the characters, but it isn't until the second episode that the isolation sets in. Perhaps it was the inexperienced actors settling into their first real roles, or maybe it was the writers needing to set the scene before they could let loose with their mad ideas. By the start of episode 2, Lister is now the last surviving human in the galaxy and is adjusting to life accompanied by a recreated hologram of his old hated bunkmate, the ship's glum computer, and a glamorous but vacant descendant of his pet cat for company. All of these characters are potentially dislikable for one reason or another, and whilst it's clear that Rimmer is the villain, for better or worse, It's hard to tell whether we are meant to like or just sympathise with Lister's predicament. I'd like to think that modern showrunners would look at these opening episodes and remix them, starting with an air of mystery as Lister awakens aboard the ship to find he's the last human alive. That's when the show really starts, but it's almost the end of the first episode. As he patrols the corridors, passing the limited remains of the long dead crew, there's great potential in the clash between the comedy, but the series' broad roots cause it to feel incredibly dated compared to series with modern production values. Television shows used to be much closer to traditional theatre in their roots, and the big ideas in this case were slowly led up to in a way that would ensure no viewer would be made to feel uncomfortable or left behind. By a modern sensibility, this is a really slow and padded approach, but it does pay dividends in the close attachment that's built over time with Lister. Red Dwarf has an almost all-male cast, and a lot of the comedy in this first series comes from juvenile schoolyard humour, and it does take the show a few episodes to judge how to handle this tone. Episode 2 was one of the later ones finished, and they moved it forwards to episode 2 because they considered it one of the strongest. However, enjoying that particular story probably requires having a better grasp of the characters and their unique situation than the first episode was able to provide. Therefore, really, the first series of Red Dwarf only begins to hit its stride by episode 3, when it becomes clear that the format of the show will be to have a new concept of the week science fiction approach that delights in exploring the reactions of this small crew to each new and unique scenario. This isn't really just a pure science fiction series at heart, it's a character grotesque, one that your patience with will rely on your reaction to and the potential enjoyment you get from the main characters. To some extent, all of the cast are exaggerated depictions of the worst aspects of society. Rimmer is proud, arrogant, aggressive, but ultimately hollow and deceitful. Lister is friendly on the surface and charming, but also lazy and thoughtless. The cat is a one-note example of pure self-centered pride, but that one note is played to a T. And the computer Holly is technically brilliant, but also uncaring and passive. It's a good setup in theory, but neither the cat or Holly act as any form of barrier between the collision of personalities that Lister and Rimmer represent. The best episodes are the ones that give a third external factor for these two people to reflect off separately, rather than just raging generally in each other's direction. The introduction of an extra crew member in future series would resolve this problem permanently, but this first series found that small additions such as an unidentified pod recovered from space, phantom illusions that represent confidence and paranoia, or a second Arnold Rimmer are the only things that serve to lift up this drama and heighten the story to be anything beyond a simple exercise in self-centered bickering. I hate to be told when discussing a long-running series that it gets good eventually, but for anyone unfamiliar with Red Dwarf who is looking for a new science fiction series and willing to give comedy a go, I can't recommend starting with Series 1. Red Dwarf would go on to have some truly brilliant stories and offer a high watermark for British science fiction in the early 90s. I'd recommend anyone find a few of the more celebrated episodes from the run between Series 3 and 5, which is when the show was arguably in its groove. Or alternatively, check out the modern post-millennium relaunch, when the actors had aged into their characters so thoroughly they'd almost become indistinguishable from them even out of costume. If you like what you see, come back and then look at this first series and see how Red Dwarf started with the end of the human race as we know it, and enjoy Lister and Rimmer's personal journey from the start.